Good evening, everyone. I'm Nehemiah Frank, the founder and editor-in-chief of the Black Wall Street Times. I'm also a descendant of families that survived the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre, but through resilience, rebuilt our beloved community. Thank you so much for joining us for such an essential conversation amid such polarizing times. Tonight's dialogue is a hot button issue for this year's midterm election, a culture war and full-on assault on K through 12 education continues with the softening of the Black plight in America from 1619 to today. Things have gotten so bad that politicians have begun banning Black authors and thus the Black experience under the guise that it promotes critical race theory. PEN America, our partner that made tonight's event possible, found that more than 1,100 books have become banned or restricted in schools across 26 states. In Oklahoma, as a result of the passing and signing of 1775 into law, books involving race, race relations, and racial history are being snatched from bookshelves. It is a sad realization for a state that just commemorated the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre, which was the most horrific racial violence against Black lives ever to occur on domestic U.S. soil. The idea of Black Wall Street swelling economic power for formerly enslaved people and their descendants was unsettling to those who were not used to change. Moreover, and it had not been for mighty pens, the story of Black Wall Street, its prosperity, its tragedy, and most importantly, its resilience would have never been fully understood. So tonight, we ask this thought-provoking question: what is the media's role in the era of book bans and the prohibition of Black authors and Black experiences? Tonight, we welcome our panel of Black excellence: Kenneth B. Morris, a descendant of two of the most influential names in American history, Frederick Douglass and Booker T. Washington; Mariama J. Lockington, an author for Black Girls Like Me, among other works, nonprofit educator and transracial adoptee who calls many places home; Professor Quresh Ali Lansana, an Emmy Award-winning producer and published author of 20 books in poetry, nonfiction, and children's literature; Onika Asamoah Caesar, the owner and founder of Fulton Street Books and Coffee and proud mama to Hadessa; Anthony Cherry, a James Madison Fellow and an Oklahoma history teacher. And before we jump into this thought-provoking convo, we'd like to thank tonight's generous sponsors: PEN America, the National Parents Union, Charles and Lynn Schusterman Family Philanthropies, and the George Kaiser Family Foundation. So let's jump right on in. Question number one. Let's go to our panelists. What is the media's role in the era of book bans and the prohibition of Black authors and Black experiences? And anyone can jump right on in.
I'm going to go ahead and jump in and get it started. Usually I love silence, but for some reason in this moment, I was like, no. I will say this. I think that we don't get to a place in community and society where book bans are being enforced without some form of media having paved the way for it to be okay to silence marginalized voices. I am not one to say that media is to blame for everything, because I think media is a reflection of the communities that those folks come from. But I do think because media has not been willing to call a thing, by the time we have gotten to book bans, the conditions for the dehumanization and the decentralization of voices and the silencing of voices has already happened. So I'll just start by saying I think that media has in part paved the way for us to be where we are with book bans today.
Mr. Morris, you got to unmute yourself.
Thank you very much for inviting me to be a part of this panel. And because of my unique connection to history and being related to Frederick Douglass and Booker T. Washington, I think about Frederick Douglass's time in the 19th century, where he understood the importance of amplifying the voices of his people that were enslaved. And he wrote 3 best-selling autobiographies. He published the North Star newspaper, which really became the mouthpiece for enslaved people. And so, again, understanding the importance of really amplifying voices of marginalized people is where we are today. And I think that the media could definitely do a better job in covering, these book bans and talking about, the importance of, young people having an opportunity to learn about history, to learn about the true history in this country, not the whitewash narrative that we've been given, where people of African descent and people of Native American descent have been placed in an inferior position by design to prop up white supremacy. And so you see these conservative-driven book bans that are reactionary and trying to, again, cover up the true history of this country. And for us to even to start to have conversations around healing and reconciliation, I believe that we need to have a reckoning of our past, which involves truth-telling.
That's good.
Well, like you, Nehemiah, I'm a journalist, but I've got some decades on you. So I'm an OG journalist, right? And I was trained in journalism as the public's trust, right? Which was a concept, which was what we were taught in journalism school about 40 or so years ago. But since then, where you find where you can trust, where the public can trust what's being presented as news and information, of course, has changed dramatically over the last several decades. But so the media, certainly, to agree with my colleagues, right? The media has a role in perpetuating such business. Thinking about, of course, in Oklahoma, many folks are introduced to people who don't look like them through what medium? Through local television news. And that news more often than not, portrays folks of color, Black and brown folks, as negative, right? Or as criminal. And that still, right? Which is why I mess with radio while I work with radios, because radio reaches 99.5% of the households of this country. Television, just about as much, right? But the idea, again, that, and I think it's sometimes hard for folks to believe in the major cities sometimes, right, that local television, local broadcast news in particular, is still a very pervasive and often the first time and most consistent ways in which folks are introduced to people who don't look like them. And then that brings me to this quote that I read that I love, and it's from a white author of a banned book. Her name is Lori Halse Anderson, and she wrote, she says, "Censorship is the child of fear and the father of ignorance." And that quote is everything, particularly, and she's a white author of a banned book. Now let's apply that to Black and brown authors and Black and brown folks with this idea of fear, right? The idea of fear and the father of ignorance, right? The child of fear, the father of ignorance. We have been that.
My goodness.
For how long? Right? I'll stop there.
My gosh. That's good.
I'll just jump in. Hi, everyone. I'm really happy to be here and part of this conversation. I think one thing that's really interesting to me, and Q, you just mentioned this, that there's a lot of fear when it comes to experiences being taught in classrooms that are maybe foreign to some of the students or teachers in the classrooms. I think there's a lot of conversation about creating safe spaces in classrooms. But to me, a safe space doesn't necessarily mean that everyone is comfortable all the time, right? That sometimes introducing bits of media, introducing books that tackle a different experience than maybe the majority of the students are in the classroom actually produces really important learning, teaches empathy. And I think that, the role of media is obviously media has played a role in making sure that these book bannings are becoming more of an issue. But I also think that media has the role of helping to provide platforms, obviously, for marginalized authors, marginalized voices, and to sometimes get out of the way a little bit and let people tell their lived experience, so that we have more examples in the media of more nuanced stories of Black folks and brown folks, and not just some of the stereotypical or highly edited cuts that we sometimes get of particular issues. So I think we also just need to reframe the idea that classrooms always have to be comfortable, right? Like we want young people to feel like their voices are heard and that they can grow and learn and that they can see themselves represented. But it's okay for a white student to feel uncomfortable about reading something about slavery because it is uncomfortable. And we need to make room for that as well.
Right. And it's uncomfortable for everybody, right?
Yeah.
I mean, as the Black student in the class, I definitely felt, targeted in a sense, but in a healthy way. People were curious about my history suddenly because, in the little paragraph that we got about institutional slavery in my history book, people wanted to know what was my plight, right? What was my ancestors' journey to get me to be in that classroom at that time. So what do you think? And I know we've got questions already here, but I'm just wondering, what do you think is the consequence of not teaching the full history? What is the consequence to the next generation of students? And I'll open that up to anyone.
Well, the banning of books, in my opinion, is a denial of First Amendment rights. It hinders dialogue in the classroom. It discourages freedom of thought and undermines students' ability to think critically. Critical thinking and self-reflection are essential for fostering empathy and tolerance and social equality and acceptance of other people and other cultures. And so the books that target race and racism and human rights activism, themes and historical biographies help students imagine worlds and experiences that are new to them and unlike their own. And so, kind of this reprehensible history of sanitizing our past is dangerous, and it continues to threaten our freedom and our democracy.
That's good.
I also think that truth-telling, storytelling is life-saving, about seeing yourself represented in a book, seeing an experience that you're not familiar represented. I think what's at stake here is young people being told that their experiences, their lives, their identities are not accepted, are not to be talked about, that they don't belong. And so I think, as an author who writes for young people, I'm really interested in writing stories that are life affirming, and I've had a lot of young readers come up and say to me, this part of your book, whether, Black and white young people, this part of your book resonated with me and made me feel seen. And so I think we are doing a great disservice to young people who are innovative and resilient and who are going through a lot more than we give them credit for. And so we need to give them stories that reflect joy and compassion and empathy, as well as stories that reflect all of the really hard things that are happening in the world that are related to our history and systemic structures and all of those things. So I think it's life and death, honestly. I think young people need to see themselves, and that's really important.
That's good.
I 100% agree that the consequences are, a balance of life and death. I believe, and I think most folks believe, right, that censorship is dehumanizing. And we have to look at the real life impact of what happens to people on a daily basis when we are dehumanized, right? If I don't believe you to be human, it is easy to believe that you don't feel pain, right? When I think about what is happening to Black folks in the medical field, if I don't believe you to be human as a young Black man, it may be easy to believe that you are violent when really you're saying, hey, I'm hurt right now and I need, a few minutes, right? If I don't believe you to be human, I may believe that you're stealing, right? Just because your presence is in my store or walking through a community where I have not seen you before. And so what we have to be very truthful about is that while, yes, censorship is in part happening because people are fearful, what they're fearful of is a truth that actually reveals them to themselves. And that is an act of violence because of the impact of the voices that are being silenced and the communities that are being marginalized. I think white folks believe, right, that by censoring and banning books, that they are setting themselves free. And what folks need to realize is that they are tightening the chains for all of us, for themselves, and also for their children. You're not freeing future generations by doing this. You're actually deepening the debt and the burden.
That is a good way. That is a whole word. All right. Do you think the media is doing a good job of keeping the censoring of the Black experience elevated?
I want to hear from Mr. Cherry.
Oh, Mr. Cherry, you're on mute. We still can't hear you. All right, we're gonna let him get that fixed. Just pop right on in whenever you get your sound fixed. So the question again is, do you think the media is doing a good job of keeping the censoring of the Black experience elevated?
A good job, as in a successful job at the censoring of the Black experience? Yes, for the most part, absolutely. I mean, what we have is a perpetuation of ignorance based in a maintaining of the status quo, right? Which is, or a maintaining of the dominant cultures, as Onika said, fear of Black and brown folks by dehumanizing and erasing our history, right? And part of what comes to mind to me, and I hope, Anthony, you'll be able to jump in this because you are teaching in a high school right now. But I spent 7 years as a reading and language arts editor at 3 of the largest textbook companies in the country. And during those 7 years, I can't tell you how many battles I had with my managing editors and whatnot about different types of images, different types of language, about nuances, and thinking again about these are K-12 textbooks. I worked in middle school and high school. Actually, I worked in all of them, K through 12. And again, all of us in this country who have experienced K-12 education, public or private, have been taught through one lens, right? We have been inculcated and taught history, even our own history, through one lens and one perspective. And that perspective is not ours, and it's never been inclusive, and it's never been whole, right? So we have to, in my mind, include the fact that Texas and California still are the states that predicate what the other 48 states experience in their textbooks, and that Texas has banned, per PEN America's numbers, right, has banned more books than any state in the country. So when they started revising history about 30 years ago now for their K-12 students, we knew those are the breadcrumbs to where we are right now, right? Those are and you start with the children, right? And inculcating the lack of knowledge, the ignorance, to help folks feel better, to perpetuate a status quo. Those children are now running for Senate next week.
That is true. It is.
Can you hear me?
Can you hear me Anthony.
Now? All right. So you'll have to forgive me. I do have some technical difficulties, but I'm glad to be here, honored to be here, humbled to be here by some of the panelists. And when I think of my own classroom, I think of this idea that books help us shape identity. They help us shape decision-making processes that we shape throughout our lives. They help us identify our relevance to society, our relevance to groups, and they affirm us and our self-actualization.
Mm.
So if there is not my own personal language, my experience, my values, the attitudes, the perspectives, even that daily activities that I engage in, if those are not reflected, if those are actually deemed as bad, then what does that do to my cognitive development and sense of self? So as educators and as people who are responsible for media, I don't think that we've done a good job. If you look at a reflection of where our students are headed when it comes to their self identity, self love, self worth, and their connection to community,
Mm.
I don't think we've done a good job as teachers or with the media. So and earlier I really wanted to chime in on what media's role is. And I really appreciate everyone talking about American democratic principles and whose job is it to protect those, and whose job is it to protect our voice and our right to freedom of speech. You know, it's not the government's role. Here, obviously, it's not the government's role because they are passing legislation that is restricting these voices.
That's
So
right.
it is the people's voice, which is reflected through the media, to stand up and protect our voices, or speak up and speak for us.
Mm. That's really good. So let's keep pushing through. This question goes directly to both Kenneth B. Morris and Mariama J. Lockington. What was your first reaction when you learned the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, an American slave, and for Black girls like me, was prohibited from some Oklahoma schools? And what about the book do you think made some people feel uncomfortable?
I'll jump in.
I've been
I
waiting
had,
a while to hear this from y'all, by the way.
oh, wow. Well, I had a lot of different emotions. I was outraged. I was saddened. My whole life, I've had people of all ages and all races come up to me sometimes with tears in their eyes, and they just want to tell me that they read Booker T. Washington's Up from Slavery. In fact, we had the conversation, Nehemiah, before we came on air here, and they'll say they always remember how old they were, what grade they were in, or if they were in college when they read Frederick Douglass's narrative. And the common theme that I hear is these books made me believe that I could do anything and be anything possible. And I took inspiration away from your ancestors' stories. And if I could thank them in person, I would. But since I can't, you become the conduit to saying thank you. And so can I give you a hug? People used to pinch my cheeks, kiss me on the cheeks, pat me on the head, but they just wanted to say thank you. So I know in my spirit and my soul how my ancestors' books can inspire young people. Frederick Douglass had a great quote. He said, "It's easier to build strong children than to repair broken men." And so when I heard about the book bans, it just really, again, saddened me, because there are going to be so many young people that aren't going to have the opportunity to be inspired by these stories in the same way, Nehemiah, you shared with me how inspired you were by reading Booker T. Washington's Up from Slavery. And you said it brought you to tears. So we are working on a project at our organization. I'm co-founder and president of Frederick Douglass Family Initiatives, and it's called 1 Million Abolitionists. And we've published a special bicentennial edition of Frederick Douglass's first autobiography. And we're working with foundations and corporations and individual donors to put 1 million of those books into the hands of young people all over the world. So we're going to put them in the hands of where young people gather out of conservative media hysteria. So, that's one project that we're working on, to make sure that if the books are going to be banned, we're going to find other ways to get them into the hands of young people.
Very good.
I love that. I also think that we don't give young people enough credit. I mean, these books are being banned, but they'll find a way. Like there are organizations and platforms working to make sure that students have access in other ways, and students are going to seek those out as well. So I am when my book For Black Girls Like Me was banned or challenged, it's actually been banned and challenged in a couple different states. I have to say that my first reaction was, I'm not surprised. I'm not happy about it. I'm saddened by it. Much like Mr. Morris, I cannot tell you how many young people have come up to me and said this story was the first book I read cover to cover where I saw myself in, and I don't even like reading. How many students have come to me and said, because of the main character, I now make people say my full name and pronounce it correctly. Students saying, I've never seen an adoptee represented in a book before, and I'm in the system. And so the idea that this book is being taken out of middle grade classrooms, because this is a middle grade book, so it's roughly for 9 to 12-year-olds, although high schoolers have also read it and enjoyed it, and adults have read it and enjoyed it, is really disheartening. And like I said, I think that there are life-affirming aspects to seeing yourself in a story. And when that's not there, like was said before, it dehumanizes you. My book is about a transracial adoptee. So it's not an autobiography, but it is inspired by my own experiences being adopted, separated from my family of origin, and raised in a white family. And when I was a young person, and growing up in the 80s and 90s and looking for books with faces like mine on the cover, with families like mine, I did not find those books. And so I love the Toni Morrison quote. I'm paraphrasing. If you don't see the book you want to see in the world, you must be the one to write it. And that's what For Black Girls is. It is taking some of the emotional core of my identity, my experiences, fictionalizing it, and providing a nuanced and honest look at what it means to be a Black girl growing up in a white family where you experience racism both outside in the world and also across your own dinner table from the people who are raising you, who may be well-intended, but not educated and may not understand the harm they are doing because share your same skin color. So I don't know exactly why it was banned, but I can guess it has something to do with looking honestly at microaggressions. I know it's made many adoptive white parents uncomfortable, and that's why I'm not surprised at it being banned.
Wow.
It also touches on what it means to grow up with a parent who lives with a mental illness. It questions where you belong. It's also about friendship and being the new kid and moving across the country. So there are so many universal themes within the book that students of all types can relate to. But for me, I wrote this specifically so that young adoptees, young Black transracial adoptees specifically, would see themselves and feel affirmed in knowing that even if they are growing up in a loving adoptive family, they still might have grief and questions and experiences that are valid.
That is so good. My goodness. Has the media reached out to you for comments specifically about the book bans that involve your family members or personal story?
I have not heard from any
Not a
media.
word.
Yeah.
Besides this wonderful event, not a word.
Yeah, well, maybe there's so many books that have been banned. They're still, we're on the list, just haven't been contacted yet.
My goodness. I don't even know how I feel about that. And so this question is for all of the panelists. Have you ever been uncomfortable with a book? Has there ever been a book that you've been uncomfortable with? It could be a textbook, or it could be fiction, nonfiction.
I'd like to chime in on this one. Huckleberry Finn. I did struggle with that one, and then when you look at who wrote it, an ex-Confederate soldier, Mark Twain, and he is not writing about the Black experience. I understand this, but the Black character that he has in here is just, he seems to be the stereotypical caricature of the Black experience. And when people talk about the books that they don't want and they want to suggest replacements for books, a lot of these books that they suggest as replacements, they really desanitize the experience of Black Americans. They don't actually give the experience from the Black perspective, written by a Black author. And just hearing the N-word, reading the N-word over and over in class, and being the only African American in there, everyone turning and looking at me as if Jim represents who I am. I really struggled with that. Um, but I personally do not believe in banning books. Uh, but I did struggle with Huckleberry Finn.
I will definitely have to admit that that was the book that I struggled with too. I remember, I think I want to say I was in the fifth or the sixth grade, and I was living in Utah, out of all places. My dad was in the military, so I lived everywhere, right? But I was one of three black kids in the entire school. And I remember every time the teacher would use the N word, it just felt like 1,000 needles were hitting me because all of the kids in the class were looking at me.
Yeah.
And the teacher, she didn't say N word, she actually said the word in class as it was written in the book. And I remember I went home and I told my mother what had occurred. And I didn't, in a strange way, like I didn't feel attacked, so to speak, by the teacher. I knew it was, it was a book. To be honest with you, at that age, I really didn't know how to feel about it. But my mom must have went off because the book was snatched and it was never read again. But I kind of felt bad because um, the teacher was a nice teacher. She really was a nice teacher, and I don't know if she had good intentions. Maybe she was trying to be inclusive, right, for the one black kid that was in the class. But and I'm almost 40 now, right? So I mean, I don't know. I don't think there was any type of cultural competency classes for teachers back then. But it was definitely a wake up call. I knew at that point that I was the black kid in the classroom.
I would just like to add that, Native Americans, they do not like non-Native Americans writing about their experience and creating these cultural fictions. They have agency. They do not like that, and they push against that. I would like to see Americans have that same agency and push. If we see something, a representation of us that we don't like, we create our own representation of ourselves. Publish those, we support those, we put money behind it.
That's
so
good.
Our image that we want to see is seen.
Yeah, I'll jump in real quickly because I think I can't pick out necessarily one book, but I will say that as a transracial adoptee, as a Black person, when I see books that are written by white adoptive parents, but are written from the perspective of an adoptee, that really bothers me, right? Because there are a lot of assumptions made there. That's not a person who's actually living that experience. They're living the experience of a parent, but they're not living the experience of their child. And so again, writing this book, my book, I think is only, excuse me, my neighbors, my book is only one of maybe 2 middle grade young adult books that are written by a Black adoptee featuring a Black adopted character.
Wow.
And there is an importance to that, right? I think oftentimes adoption is thrown into media and stories in a really positive way or in a fairy tale way or in ways that are really stereotypical, but there's a lot of nuance to the experience, just like there's a lot of nuance to being a Black person in the United States. And so we need stories that attend to all those nuances. And we need publishers to understand that just because they have one Black writer writing about, one, area of Black experience doesn't mean there isn't room for a vastness of Black stories. And I think sometimes there's a tendency to say, oh, we've got 3 Black middle grade writers, so we're good, and we can move on. And that's just not the case. I mean, how many stories about white boys do we have talking about Huckleberry Finn? There's room for more for all of us.
Absolutely.
I'd like to circle back to something Mariama and Anthony just said too, going back to Huck Finn and Nehemiah, you as well. And so I'm going to ask this question both literally and figuratively, right? So y'all know that in the 90s, the publisher of Huck Finn decided to put out a version without the N-word, right? And I don't recall, and maybe some of you do and can help me out, if the movement to create this, inward sanitized version of Huck Finn was because of us, or because of some other kind of I don't know, white guilt or something, right? But the question here, and that's part of the figurative and the literal. But the question here is, did the removal of the N word from Huck Finn make the book any more palatable for you? Right? And the answer is probably no. Right. It's probably no, I would assume. Anthony, what are you thinking?
Yeah, I would say no, absolutely. It's, definitely the N word stung quite a bit, but still it's overall the caricature and representation of the Black male in that book.
Yeah. Nehemiah? No, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, so I think if had I been, if let's just go back to the 6th grade, right? If the teacher would have said N word, I don't know what would have happened in the class. I'm thinking that, a kid probably would have been like, N-word, what's that? And then the teacher would have had to explain what was going on, So I think you're absolutely correct that, it doesn't take any less sting out of that word if it's used in that context.
Yeah. And then the answer, I'm sorry, Onika, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say the other thing that this is definitely highlighting, just listening to all of your experiences, is that we need the stories. But the other challenge that we're facing is that we also need educators and systems, right? That have the competence to hold developmentally appropriate conversations that allow people to walk away with the right takeaways and to be able to hold space for how everyone enters that conversation.
Look, she's ready to preach too.
Yep.
Yeah. So I want to double back and answer the question for myself, right? And it'd be interesting to I'll just put it out there, right? So the book that has been most vexing to me over the years is, other than Mein Kampf, right, is Uncle Tom's Cabin, right? And so it's interesting that, that Anthony would go to the Huck Finn, y'all would go to Huck Finn, and we look at Uncle Tom's Cabin. And again, thinking about Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote that as some sort of abolitionist tome. Let me back up. White abolitionist tome, right? And yet it makes my skin crawl. I mean, it literally makes my skin crawl. And thinking about that in the context of, say, there's a white writer who's been publishing now for 20, 30 years named Susan Straight. Some of y'all probably familiar with her. And Susan Straight is a white woman out of California. And about 20 years ago or so, I mean, she's written many novels about the Black experience. But right after the Rodney King Rebellion, she wrote a book about a Black family living in South Central. Right. And she still gets praises for her depictions of writing of folks outside of her culture and experience, outside of her authentic experience. Mm-hmm. But we don't believe in censorship. But do we how y'all feel about that? I'll park it there.
Well, I just wanted to jump in talking about Uncle Tom's Cabin, and that's a book that's made me uncomfortable for a lot of reasons. But in particular, Uncle Tom was based off of a real life character, Josiah Henson, and we know how the Uncle Tom moniker has been perpetuated in the Black community, and what that means. It's like the worst thing you could say to a Black person, a Black person saying to a Black person. But Josiah Henson was this person that escaped from slavery, and he starts a settlement in Dresden, Canada, and he was like, that should be a positive thing to say about somebody if you know who the true character was. But I just wanted to talk about a book that made me uncomfortable, and you may be surprised, and that's Frederick Douglass's Narrative, his first autobiography that was published in 1845. And most people that descend from people of African descent that were enslaved can only imagine how their ancestors were treated and the exploitation and the brutality that they went through. I can read my ancestors, Booker T. Washington's Up from Slavery and Frederick Douglass's Narrative, and get a firsthand account directly from them. And, when I first read the Narrative, I think I was probably about 11 years old, or the first time I tried to read it, and I couldn't get through it. And even to this day, I'll read it at least once a year. And I have difficulty getting through it, even though I know what's coming, because again, my ancestor spent 20 years enslaved. And, people would say to him, they would see this white-haired statesman later in life who was the first African-American nominated for vice president of the United States, first African-American U.S. Marshal, first African-American ambassador and consul general to Haiti, first African-American recorder of deeds in the District of Columbia, and the first African-American to have a statue dedicated in his honor in 1899. And they would say, Frederick, where'd you go to school? I need to know where you went to school. Where'd you get your education? And having never spent one day of his life in a classroom, he was a self-taught scholar. He would respond on occasion by saying, my diploma is written on my back. And his diploma was written on his back. So, there are books that make you feel uncomfortable, but they can make you feel uncomfortable in a way that's positive and moving forward.
That's so real. That's good.
Yeah.
I'll tell you that, as a descendant of families that survived the massacre, for me, for those who have Greenwood 100, the magazine that we put together, it was very difficult to go through that. Because I felt like 100 years later, I'm reliving, the trauma of what my own ancestors experienced. And so I can imagine, for you and other people in your family, that's got to be a difficult thing to go through for any of them, because it's literally like your DNA is traumatized. You have traumatized DNA from that experience. And you're still living with that now. It doesn't just go away, right?
Yeah.
I want to keep pushing through. Onika, as a bookstore owner, have you seen an uptick in sales on books that are becoming banned in K through 12 education? And has the media reached out to you about these book bans?
Yes, absolutely. Adults are like children. You tell them they can't do something or whatever the case is, and everyone wants to do it. So especially for books that are banned or being challenged, we always see an uptick in the sales of those books. We have had a few local media outlets kind of reach out to ask us what we are doing in response to book bans. So it's been an interesting conversation. The challenge, though, is how do we sustain the attention in a way that leads to change, that we don't continue to kind of come back to this place every few years. But always see an uptick in book sales for sure.
Good stuff. Quraish, we are living in strange times. What about these Black books and Black experiences drives fear? Should they even be concerned about banning books?
I'm not sure who the they are, but I will tell you that the banning of Black books and Black experiences is about, in my opinion, about not wanting to address real history, the truth of history. History is, as someone said eloquently earlier, history is supposed to make us uncomfortable because if we're looking at what really happened, I mean, again, thinking about it like this, that the state of Oklahoma gave a tax break to Martin Scorsese to film Killers of the Flower Moon about the Osage murders, right? In the state of Oklahoma, but Killers of the Flower Moon is a banned book in the state of Oklahoma. Right. So, I mean, there it is. Right. So, yeah, the banning of books about and by Black and brown folks is about an attempt to dismiss, as Onika said eloquently earlier, dehumanize us, make our stories less relevant. And so folks don't have to look at that history and the truth of that history. Right. I was teaching last night at Greenwood Cultural Center about Greenwood, right? And y'all know this, right? Nehemiah and Onika in particular, and Anthony, you know this because you're here, right? That you can look at North Tulsa, Greenwood today, and you could make the direct connection to North Tulsa and Greenwood 101 years ago and understand where we are now with the destruction of the district, the loss of billions of generational wealth, the fact that we don't own anything anymore, right? that history is the tether is clear. We experienced resilience a couple times, as Nehemiah mentioned, certainly in the 40s, certainly 4 years in 1923, and then again in 1941, and then the highway. But you can look at North Tulsa right now and see real history you can't see the history from 1906 when OW and John and Lula May and folks built it and JB built it, but you can see the history from 1921 and its remnants and how alive that destruction is in our health, in our economics, and in almost every aspect of Black life in Tulsa. You can see it today and make that direct correlation, but folks don't want to think about that. Whoever those they are in your question, Nehemiah, they want to say, "Oh, that happened 100 years ago." Stop digging up these graves, because that's not our history, right? But for us, for Black and brown folks, just like Anthony bringing up the indigenous folks and their story here, that stuff is palpable today as it was 100 years ago. Period. And that's what folks don't want to look at.
That's real. So we got about 15 minutes left before we jump into our question and answering session. If you are watching this, please share it, comment, and stick around, because we're going to have a questioning answer session. You can ask any of the panelists any questions that your heart desires. So I've been thinking, what to, and I already know the answer to the question, but at least for me, right? And Mariama had touched on empathy, right? What can non-Black students get from reading about the Black experience?
Well, there has to be some type of emotional investment. I really appreciate the comment about empathy. You have to be emotionally invested in the life of one of these characters, especially if your only interaction is secondary. If you're not having any primary interactions with Black people, your secondary interaction is through books or media. You have to be invested in not only that character's outcomes, but their families, the communities that they're set in. And you have to want to see a good outcome. And that's why I don't like Huck Finn's, because there is no investment in the outcome of the character Jim. You know, there's no emotional attachment. They sail him down the river at the end, and that's it. But I think empathy, also seeing someone that they're not normally seeing next to them every day in a story, and caring.
I think empathy, yes. I also think wholeness, right? Because white folks are not white. They don't exist in whiteness without Black folks being Black and us existing Blackness. And so if you deny the existence of Blackness, you're denying your own sense of wholeness. You're only white because I'm Black. And if you want to pretend like we're not here, right, you're never going to get to a sense of how you became white and how you exist in community today. The other thing I think is that we fail to remember, right, that we all contribute to society. And so without understanding how interconnected our outcomes are, right, we're going to continue to see society and community have this social and cultural deterioration.
That's real. That's good. And economic as well, right? Yeah.
Yeah, I also think that, like Mr. Cherry said, students have to have an investment in the character connection. But like I said before, Black, we're nuanced. We have all types of experiences, identities, and all of those things can be when a character is written well or on the page. And when I do school visits a lot, and I go into 3rd through 8th grade classes, and I do a 15-minute book talk. And sometimes the students have heard of my book, sometimes they haven't. And my entry point is starting talking about friendship, and a friendship that's been tested. And I ask, has anyone had a friendship in their life that's been tested? Because my book begins with a girl moving away from her best friend with her family across the country. And that's where we start. within the conversation. And then throughout the presentation, and it's interactive, we talk about music. We talk about what it feels like to be the new kid. We talk about what it feels like to not feel like you belong in your family, or to feel like someone in your family is sad all the time, right? And then we talk about race, and we talk about the exact experience of the specific character in the book. And so all of those things are things that in some way make my character whole, but also are a part of a lot of other young people's experiences,
Good.
regardless of race.
That's good.
And I think that's important. And I had a teacher, well-meaning, come up to me and say, this should just be called For Girls Like Me, because, um, like this relates to all girls. And I said, it can relate to many types of different girls, but I wrote it for Black girls like me. And that's also important, right? That is in the title, and that shows up. And I can't tell you how many times I've been at, a book fair where people are walking by, and, a Black young person, a Black girl will see the cover and just instantly come over and say, that book is for me. I have no idea what it's about, but it's for me. And there's an importance to that too.
Oh, that's so good.
Yeah, I think about Frederick Douglass's book, The Narrative, and it was published over 175 years ago. And it's a book that the Library of Congress named one of the 88 books that shaped America. And what is it about his story that resonates still today, and that people can relate to today, whether you're Black or white or brown? And, it's a coming of age story. So as Mr. Cherry said, you get invested in the character and the outcome. While none of us can imagine what it's like to have been enslaved, it's also truth telling. So you had a young man who was only 7 years removed from slavery at the age of 27, and he writes this book. And at the time, he was what we would have called a fugitive slave. Now we call those people freedom seekers, but he was a fugitive slave. And he was out there talking about the abolition of slavery and lecturing for the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society. And he's good looking, he's well dressed, he's articulate, he's charismatic, he's theatrical, he's everything that a person that was pro-slavery couldn't believe a Black man could be. And so they started to call him a fraud. They couldn't believe that he was who he claimed to be. And so he writes this autobiography, and in it he names names and he names places, and it shows the courage that he had, because the other problem that he had after it was published, it became a bestseller. And that's the last thing that you want, is the notoriety of a best-selling book if you're trying to hide from your enslaver. And so it really shows you the courage he has. And yes, the book still resonates today.
That is so good.
I'll say one more thing, which is also like upholding the intersections that Black folks have in our identities, and how that can be liberating for other communities as well, right? When I think about understanding Black liberatory work, especially when you think about Black folks who are queer, and how that has allowed a lot of folks who are advocates for the LGBTQIA community to also like understand that struggle through the lens of Black and queer liberation, or Black folks who Black women, right? And understanding how Black women have created space for white women to also find liberation in their own work, and sometimes creating those blueprints. Black folks who are also differently abled, right? Like there are so many intersections that allow other communities to find a path toward a more liberated world. And so I think honoring kind of those intersections is also important when we think about what Blackness is.
I'd like to just jump in on that point. I read a quote from Christopher Myers from the New York Times, and he talks about this idea of the apartheid of literature and only narrowing down the Black experience to civil rights, racism, or slavery. But then actually we need more dynamic stories of Black characters experiencing like adventure and personal growth and curiosity, love, and dramas like in even investigations, more diverse plots.
And if I could just jump in really quickly too, something that I find so interesting in some of the feedback I've gotten about For Black Girls Like Me is that there are some people who get frustrated. It's often white people who get frustrated that at a certain point of the book, one of the parents was having a mental health crisis, and they were like, well, I wanted it to stay with, like, the main character's story, and I thought this was about like adoption and other things. And the thing is, it's about both. And the fact that there are Black young girls who are growing up with parents who live with various forms of mental illness. There are Black girls I myself live with, chronic anxiety. And so we need those intersections and those nuances as well. And we need a story where a Black girl can be struggling to be a caretaker of her parent, even though that's not a responsibility that should be on her. And so I think it's just really interesting when people want a story that you write to be a certain vision of what they have for what it means to be a Black girl, what Black girlhood looks like. And when it doesn't fit that, sometimes folks reject it.
You mean we're not a monolith, fam?
We're not a monolith, no.
Wait, hold up. Wait a second. What you saying? Wait.
We're not a monolith.
I just want to say that, Mariama, you said so much there, and I think a lot of people probably, I know it skipped over some folks, but I definitely got the message.
To that end, do we have time for me to tell a quick story about my mentor in this context?
Yeah, we got 5 ahead.
So I had the great blessing and privilege of being Miss Gwendolyn Brooks's last protege, her last student. And one of my favorite of the many experiences that she had, I won't say favorite, but I'll say most impactful, right? Is when her first book, A Street in Bronzeville, came out in 1950, and it received all this critical praise, was considered like the Spoon River of the Negro, right? Because it was Miss Brooks observing Bronzeville, observing Southside Chicago, and it was street and real and gritty, and talked about Black life in a very real way on the South Side of Chi. And then when she put her second manuscript forward, first of all, it was a novel, and they said, nah, we don't want a novel about a young Black girl and a Black family. Nobody's going to want to read that. So she said, okay, so she put the novel down, and she revised and reworked the novel into a book called Annie Allen, which was her second book of poetry, which was a book that took a Black girl's life, a young Black girl child's life, from birth to death, right? And Harper Row gave her half as much money for her advance, because they just weren't sure after this whole really Negro heavy thing that folks were going to be into this story of this young Black woman from birth to death, and some very heightened, very, very, very epic language that she put forth in the creation of this masterpiece. And it won the Pulitzer Prize. She was the first Black person to ever win the Pulitzer Prize. And it was, her command of language, of course, unquestionable. But the idea that she took half as much in advance for a story of a young Black woman growing up from birth to death with this epic, vaulted, heightened language, like we weren't worthy of Iliads and Odysseys. We weren't worthy of epic stories. Nobody's going to read that. Let's go back to that Black stuff in the street. Let's go back to them prostitutes and such, right? And the beatings on the street. And she won the Pulitzer Prize, and then went to get it and was mistaken for the coat lady, right? That is, right? That's us, right? That is our story in so many ways. But the idea that the themes are universal, but our experiences are nuanced, right? And it's the nuances that folks often are very frightened of, right? We just gotta all be the Black folks in the first book. We can't be the black girl child in the second book. Be the Black person in the first book, and we're okay with you, right?
Wow, my gosh. I think you might have just affirmed what Mariama was talking about.
Exactly.
Very good. Well, you guys, we are pretty much at the top of the hour. So if you have any questions for the panelists, please ask them. We are here to answer your questions. And for any of the panelists, if you have any questions for any of the other panelists, or if you have a question you want to bring to the floor for all of us to entertain, please feel free. Anybody.
A question that I like to ask is just, is there a book from childhood, from young adulthood that you remember feeling really like seen by? Like you read a book and it was like this, I see myself on the page here. And what book was that? No pressure.
I think Onika is grabbing a book off the shelf right now.
Awesome.
So this was like my favorite book.
I love that book.
Yes, A Girl Named Disaster.
Yes.
I definitely had high hopes that, you know, I had a parent somewhere in another, I don't know where, who I was going to get to run away to. But I love this book and like the nuance of girlhood and managing emotions and connection and disconnection with family and passing down almost like generational trauma. I mean, I read this book multiple times. It was probably the first book I read over and over. My daughter just turned with the light. Girl Named Disaster, favorite book.
It's a great book. I'm so glad that you brought that up.
So we do have a question from Dion. My high school AP teacher told our class slavery wasn't that bad. As one of 2 Black students in class, I didn't have the language to respond. How did you find your voice? What a great question.
First, I would say you have to be knowledgeable. First, you can't expect the dominant culture to provide you with the information that you need for self-actualization. You're going to have to do your own journey intellectually. Look for mentors who suggest books to read, but you're going to have to be knowledgeable if you're going to come to someone in a position of authority over you and exercise agency. That's my first suggestion.
That's a great question. We do a series of Underground Railroad trips for educators, and this past summer we did 5 week-long trips. And by the time we're finished, we have about 250 teachers. They're all K through 12 teachers that would have attended the trip, and we're really following the footsteps of freedom seekers that were running away from slavery to Canada after the 1850 Fugitive Slave Law was enacted. And the common theme that I hear from these teachers, and some of them are history teachers, they're across all disciplines, but the common theme that I hear from white teachers and Black teachers is that, why didn't I know this history? You know, why was I not taught this history? And everybody comes to the trip with different emotions, but that's the thing. Why didn't I learn this true history? And had I learned this, I would be able to teach it better and with more confidence. And my students would benefit from hearing the truth. And so when you hear a comment like that slavery wasn't that bad, you know, it's just that's a product of just really poor teaching about our history. You know, and I think I started off my first comments when talking about the sanitizing and whitewashing of history in this country. There was a lawmaker, a legislator in Virginia that was passing a critical race theory legislation. And in it, he talked about the Lincoln-Douglas debates, but he explained it as Lincoln and Frederick Douglass. And here's somebody that didn't know the history, didn't understand the history. And we're going to have a whole generation of kids, people coming up that will be politicians, they'll be teachers, they'll be business people that will not have an understanding of this history, especially if we're banning books and students are not having an opportunity to learn.
Wow.
I would also just say, I mean, I agree with everything that has been said already. But it takes time sometimes to find your voice. And it's okay if in the moment that this particular comment was made, that it didn't feel safe or like it was going to be productive to say anything. I mean, I think sometimes you have to sort of take, mental note about a particular person and particular moment, save it away for later, and go do your homework, go do your organizing, go be with your community, and then, you know, gradually learn how to speak up in moments if it feels like it's going to be productive. And sometimes it's not going to be, based on you know, a variety of things, based on maybe the history that this particular person was taught, based on some of their own assumptions. So I think that it's okay to pause for a moment too in these moments, and take account of your safety and your resources and your capacity as well.
Yeah, and just to jump in and piggyback on what Fam just said too, particularly, and I think most of us on this panel can relate to this to a certain extent, right? Being one of two Black students in a classroom can be debilitating, can force one to rethink how they even define their own narrative, how it can be, the way I phrase it here in Oklahoma, and I experience a little bit of this, but getting drunk on someone else's narrative, right? And so so one of the things that it's important, and so I don't want you to beat yourself up about it, Dion. I mean, because you've obviously you're continuing to grow and move past that, and that just comes from learning and knowledge and reading and accessing, as Anthony said, mentors and other folks who can help guide you and help your growth and evolution. But it's very easy for those of us who grow up in really sort of, I don't like the word minority, but in the minority situations in terms of numbers, right? To kind of disremember or lose who we are, because the dominant culture, the dominant narrative can be so persuasive and so pervasive. So just don't beat yourself up, and please move, try and heal in the ways in which Mr. Cherry and Mariama have suggested, that it's about going and getting that knowledge every way you can access the knowledge to continue to remember that our history is rich, and that we are defined by love and resilience. Right. And if you remember that and you start to really internalize that based on going and getting this knowledge, you'll be good, and you'll be good for all of us. And that's what we need. We need us to be good for us, right? For a change, right?
So well put. Look, when I tell y'all that I'm feeling fulfilled tonight, like my cup is filling up, it is filling up. We have to be good for us. I absolutely love that. I don't even know if this is a fun question or not. But whenever people bring up Black History Month comes around, and people who know nothing about Dr. King, right? They'll start throwing out quotes and pretending to be, I guess, woke for 1 month, right? And then they go back to I don't want to being the devil. I'm just going to say that, right? Being the devil. And I always wonder, I'm like, if Dr. King was alive today, like, what would he say about, these things that are taking place today? And so I wonder, like, Mr. Morris, what do you think your ancestors, Frederick Douglass and Booker T, what do you think they would have to say about these book bans, and the banning of their own narratives from school?
Yeah, well, it's difficult for any of us to know what they would say or do if they were here today, but because their blood flows through my veins, I'll take some liberty and say that they would be outraged. I think they would be outraged. They would probably take some solace in knowing that there has been some progress. We did elect an African-American president. We have our first female vice president of color. They probably would be somewhat pleased to see that progress, but they would be outraged. That's the only word I can think of to know that there's still so much work to be done. And that with the challenges that we're facing in this country still today. And, Frederick Douglass said, I love Frederick Douglass quotes, if there's no struggle, there's no progress. And so they would both still be speaking truth to power. Frederick Douglass wrote 3 best-selling autobiographies. He wrote a fictional novella, not many people know that, called The Heroic Slave. And he wrote thousands of essays and articles in his various newspapers. So I have no doubt that they would both be out there still doing the work. Frederick Douglass as the great abolitionist, and Booker T. Washington as the great educator and founder of Tuskegee Institute in 1881, which, by the way, he founded it at the age of 25 years old. And I also think about you know, what will our great, great, great grandchildren, those of us that choose to have children, what would they say about us 150 years from now in this moment in time? Were we on the right side of history, or were we on the wrong side of history? I was having a conversation yesterday about some descendants of people that I know that would be embarrassed for people to know who their ancestors were. And they will not sit in a room when their ancestors are being discussed because of how horrible they feel and how embarrassed they feel. Unfortunately, I don't have that problem because my ancestors were on the right side of history. And I know all of us, and hopefully everybody that's tuned in tonight will be on the right side of history and speak truth to power and do the work that needs to be done, because history lives in each of us. It doesn't just live in me because I descend from two people that have some notoriety, but we all descend from people that made a difference, people that sacrificed maybe their lives just for the freedoms that we do have, maybe have sacrificed their lives just so that we even have a right to sit in a classroom or sit here and have a conversation about these issues. And when we talk to young people about this idea that greatness flows through all of our veins and we all stand on the shoulders and walk in the shoes of those that came before us.
So I have to jump in real quick, right? I'm going to throw a curveball at you. Through discovering my own history, right? I've discovered, right? Of course, my last name is Frank. So I discovered that my third great grandfather, he was from Germany and he was a Jewish man, right? And he actually owned my third great grandmother. And I'm here because of, you know, his sin or whatever was going on, right? But I also discovered that some of my family members were Confederate soldiers. So do you ever think about that history too? Do you claim that too? I mean, and I always, and I'll say this, going back to the Centennial and Courage knows, you know, when I dropped Greenwood 100, let me tell you, it was personal. I was going after everybody that owed my community something. And I wanted to be as loud as I possibly could with the platform that I have. And I dug out the mayor's family history because he was so proud of his history. I said, well, guess what? Your family also did this. Y'all own this many Black people. And, you know, I exposed that on MSNBC on Tiffany Cross show. And it can't be taken back now because people have done the research and nobody's come after me with a libel suit. All the evidence is there. But what I also tried to explain to him is like, you know, this is our history as American people. We are so mixed. And I mean, it is what it is. Like you would not be sitting here if it wasn't for your white ancestors. So like, how does everyone in the room feel about that?
That makes me think of a book called Jefferson's Sons, right? And you think of this idea of Jefferson and Sally Hemings. I think that was her name, correct me if I'm wrong. But this story is romanticized if you look at it from white authors' perspectives and history. This is a romantic relationship. They were in love. So that is definitely a sanitized and whitewashed version of history. But if you peel back the curtain and you look at it from the perspective of Sally Hemings and their family, that's the story that needs to be read by students.
Yeah, and you bring up, you know, an excellent point. So Frederick Douglass's father was presumed was his owner, his enslaver. Same with Booker T. Washington. So of course that's a part of my history as well. This is American history, it's shared history, and that's why it's important that we know this history. You know, I choose to create and write my own narratives and tell my own stories. And that's what Frederick Douglass did so well. He told his story over and over and over. And here we are talking about him today, 200 years after he was born, and he didn't let anybody else shape his story. And so, yes, I recognize that part of my family history, but that's not who I am.
That's good.
Yeah, and that circles back to what Onika was saying a moment ago, I think, about wholeness, right? That You know, 25,000 white folks didn't burn down their own, didn't invade Maple Ridge and burn down their own neighborhood, right? 25,000 folks and from 3 different directions in an organized attack that was state sanctioned came to Greenwood at 5:06 in the morning and commenced to do what they did, right? And so there's no way that our histories are not intertwined, right? Because we didn't burn our stuff down, right? And so that's what's so insidious about this ban on critical race theory in Oklahoma, House Bill 1775. It's some way of trying to legitimize and legislate the idea that our histories are somehow not intertwined, right? And until African American studies or African American history or Black American history is not an elective, until Indigenous American history is not an elective, but a major, until women and gender studies is a major, right? And not a minor, not an elective, then the histories will continue, our histories will continue to be minimized for those of us who are already marginalized. And I'm going to throw this out there because y'all are brilliant people. Here's the power of language and the power of the media, right? What in the hell does the word majority minority mean, right? Like, who came up with that? It's insidious, but it speaks to the power of language and then the media, certain media outlets to perpetuate such a concept. It's an oxymoron. Sorry, I'm an English professor too, right? It's an oxymoron, but it is sort of a new nomo to define how the fact that the Hispanic Latinx population is the largest, fastest growing population in the country, but y'all still below us. You still less than, right? That's the power of language.
Anthony, did you want to chime in on that?
On a question you asked earlier, I really wanted to chime in. You asked about Martin Luther King Jr. and what he would say. Can I chime in on that question?
Yes, please.
If you go back to 1965, you'll see like in the 1960s, the civil rights movement, we had Richard Wright, A. Philip Randolph, Langston Hughes, other civil rights members being brought before the House Un-American Activities Committee. They're being investigated as un-American. Like, these are Black writers, these are politicians, these are people. Langston Hughes was also wrote screenplays. So these are media people who are being banned and investigated and labeled as un-American. At the same time, the Ku Klux Klan is not labeled un-American. You have civil rights leaders being investigated while Klans members are considered American. Now, this brings up the question of the status quo. Who gets to be labeled American? Who gets to be labeled un-American? What stories fall into the status quo and get to be and rise to the top? And I say, just like civil rights leaders in 1960s, that Black experience is as American as any other experience.
Yeah, in the 19th century too. I mean, Frederick Douglass was labeled un-American when he gave in his famous speech, "What to the slave is your 4th of July," where he calls out the hypocrisy of a nation that espouses ideals of, the founding ideals and Christianity being used as a tool to oppress and enslave people. And he called out the hypocrisy of a nation that would enslave millions of people on its blood-drenched soil while talking about freedom and celebrating freedom. And how dare you invite me to speak today? Do you mean to mock me, to talk about your independence? So
that's good. That reminds me of the time, and I don't know if the place is still open, the Whitney Plantation. So my people are from Louisiana. Aviolas Parish, Louisiana is where they're from. And I remember when I went to New Orleans and I went to the gigantic white cathedral. And I just remember, like, I had this eerie feeling of like, they probably docked my ancestors here and took us into the white church and baptized us. And then they took us out to Plantation Row. But I remember specifically stopping in one of uh, the rooms, and I saw a little, I don't even know what they're called, but they're the little benches where you kneel down and you pray. And I just thought it was such a bizarre thing and so well thought to put that there because it was exactly what was happening, right? Um, but I do wonder, like, well, I guess I don't need to wonder because at the end of the day, it all comes down to fear. We do have another question. This one is a little long. Let me see. Do you believe these bans could be a domino effect of more and increased in mainstream knowledge and uncovering of the historic lies taught in our school systems to students? That is the question for the panelist, and I'll leave it up there.
If I'm reading this correctly, and ignoring the question that comes after it, which is not a question, not from you, Facebook user here, but do we believe that these bans could increase mainstream knowledge of these of history? No, I don't know. I mean, Onika did speak to the fact that that there's an uptick in sales of these banned books in her store, but those are conscious adults, right? Who are seeking this knowledge. I don't think the mainstream as a whole are going to go to Fulton Street or Essewan in LA or you know the any bookstores period and go search for banned books. I think the mainstream as a whole are just going to follow what has been constituted for them by their politicians, their preachers, their pundits, whatever news outlet they watch or listen to, as their norm. And they're going to stay in their lane. They're going to stay in their box. So my personal opinion, it's a great question. My personal opinion is no. I don't think this knowledge, this history will become somehow more prioritized or privileged to the masses because of this attack on knowledge. If anything, I think it'll be exactly the opposite.
Yeah, history has shown that it is exactly the opposite, and the desired effect is to keep the populace ignorant of this history. And unless you're, as you said, Q, consciously seeking it out, most people are not going to do that.
And we also have to remember that especially when books are banned from school libraries or school districts, those are the adults are the gatekeepers. So if those books are not even making it onto the shelves or are being pulled even before the school year starts, a lot of times that's where a young person is probably going to encounter these different narratives. So I don't personally think it will either have a domino effect. I think we have a lot of folks in this world who are happy to just stay in their lane. And while I think that the uptick in sales for some banned books is a thing that's happening, I also wonder about sustaining that. I also wonder about if people are actually then reading those books and absorbing and then talking with their communities about it. I mean, I feel a little bit conflicted about people rushing to get For Black Girls Like Me, but then what's the conversation that happens after? It sort of feels like when folks discovered Juneteenth was something that we celebrated and took over for a month, and all of a sudden I was getting emails from like Ulta wishing me a happy Juneteenth, but I haven't heard anything since. So I don't think it'll be a domino effect. I think it's really dangerous.
So this made me think, and I don't even, Mr. Morris, correct me if I'm wrong, but a Frederick Douglass quote that said, "To make a contented slave, you must make a thoughtless one."
Yeah, that's accurate. He said it a number of different ways. When he was about 8 or 9 years old, he was chosen from the plantation on the eastern shore of Maryland, where he'd been born with the name Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey, to go to Baltimore to be the house servant for his enslaver's family. And when he got there, he had a slave mistress that was teaching her son to read and write. She had never had, and I'm using the word slave instead of enslaved, but she had a slave. She never had a slave before, so she didn't know that it was illegal to teach him. She begins to teach him his ABCs, and this is how the story has been whitewashed. The nuance to this story is that he asked her to teach him to read.
Whoa.
And that was his first act of self-liberation. And she begins to teach him. The lessons continue for a little while until his enslaver finds out, and he gets angry. And he looks at his wife and he looks at Frederick, and he said, "You cannot teach a slave how to read and write, because if you do, it will unfit him to be a slave." And Frederick heard that message loud and clear, and he knew right then and there that that was going to be his pathway to freedom, was knowledge, education, learning to read and write, and he teaches himself to read and write.
Hence why they've snatched it, right? My goodness.
And what thank you for that story, Kenneth, and what a perfect sort of, unfortunately, perfect analogy for where we are right now. Right.
Preach.
Keep them thoughtless.
Right.
Keep them thoughtless. Don't think.
Yeah, don't think. Don't shine any light into the mental darkness. And I remember I had a 16-year-old boy tell me one time I was in Albany having a conversation with teenagers at a barbershop. And I told the story about how Frederick Douglass was always so hungry as a child. And he always had this pit of hunger in his stomach that would never go away. And on occasion, when he would get food, the overseer would take cornmeal mush and throw it into a trough similar to what pigs eat out of. And all of the children, including Frederick, would crawl on their hands and knees as fast as they could to eat what little food was in there, to eat like animals, to eat like pigs. And when Frederick was teaching himself to read and write, one of the things that he did was he traded bread for reading lessons. He traded biscuits, food, something of such great importance. And the young man, got it right away. They said, "So, Mr. Morris, what you're telling me is he would rather feed his mind and have his stomach go empty." And this young boy said, "You know what? If I could just describe what's happening in my mind, it's like a pitch black hallway with no doors, no windows. I don't know which way to turn. I don't know how to get out of it. But what you just told me about Frederick's story, I now see some light being shown into my mental darkness, and I know which direction to point, and I have hope that I can get out of this."
Mr. Morris, you just made me think of one of the most influential things that I've read in college, and it was Walker's Appeal. David Walker's Appeal.
David Walker's Appeal, yeah.
1829, the first Black man to self-publish his own writings, like the OG of banned books.
Yeah,
right? He had his printing press burnt down and ran off in Boston, the cradle of independence. So this goes way back, and I like how Dr. Q has tied it into our current experience.
Absolutely.
My goodness. Well, we are 3 minutes out from closing. This has been, I'll tell y'all this, I am going to remember this panel forever. This is probably my favorite panel. The ones that I've been on TV can't even trump this, because I feel like this is what we should be talking about. And I'm so thankful to PEN America and to the National Parents Union, the Schusterman Foundation, the George Kaiser Foundation, for helping us host this event. We have 2 minutes left, and we know what's going down next Tuesday. What is your message to America?
Frederick Douglass had his voice, he had his pen, and eventually had his vote. And perhaps pen, we need a metaphor, the keyboard. So we have our voices, our keyboards, and our vote. And we have to hold our local politicians, our state politicians, our federal politicians accountable, and demand that they do better and identify policies that perpetuate systemic racism in American institutions, and vote them out if they're not going to do what we need them to do. I know that there's a lot of frustration and people that don't think that their vote matters, but it does. It matters.
Yeah, my message is just vote. Educate yourself on the candidates' votes. And I would also say, I mean, next Tuesday is very important, but I would also say that paying attention to who your school board is and going to meetings and sharing your voice in the face of these bannings, understanding what's on your child's curriculum, what's not being taught, who's missing from it. Some of this advocacy is going to have to come from you. And you know, making sure that we are allowed to have diverse voices within the classroom. So paying attention to that, asking your student what they're reading, what they'd like to read, and making sure we're making room for that.
I would like to say that I know it seems like what's going on at the federal level is just theater, and we're sitting back and watching without any power. But as you so expertly said, we do have more power at the local level, and we can help campaign. It's not too late to volunteer. You can put signs out, you can still call, you can still knock on doors for the candidate that you think represents your values.
And I'll just quickly add, because my colleagues here have said everything so eloquently, but get the knowledge of the candidates, get the knowledge of the propositions, and then put everyone that you know who's of eligible voting age in a car, in a minivan, I don't care, and get a bus. Y'all walk as a group, but go engage. It's in this civic duty called voting, right? Malcolm X, the bullet or the ballot, right? So please get everyone you know, get the knowledge, and go vote.
Absolutely. Thank you again, panelists, for joining us. Everyone that's out there, thank you so much for sticking around for the hour and 30 minutes. I hope you got something from this panel. I definitely did. I'm going to go early vote tomorrow. So if you have, I believe early voting starts in Oklahoma tomorrow. So get out and cast your voice. Thank you so much for joining us.
Your ear.